On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television with a calm voice and a loaded message. Behind the measured tone was a decision that would quietly rupture the global financial system. With a single stroke, he severed the US dollar's tie to gold, ending the Bretton Woods Agreement and marking the birth of fiat currency as we know it. It was framed as a temporary suspension, but the world would never return. That night, the dollar transformed from a certificate backed by real metal into something far more dangerous, a promise backed only by trust. No guns, no headlines, just a Sunday night broadcast, and suddenly, every currency on earth became untethered. Few understood what it meant then. But looking back now, that calm, deliberate announcement was the first crack in a monetary system that is still unraveling today. By the early 1970s, America was bleeding gold. Foreign governments, sensing weakness, began demanding physical gold in exchange for their dollars, something the Bretton Woods system promised since 1944. But Washington had a problem. Decades of military spending, welfare expansion, and global interventions had created a mountain of debt. The U.S. had printed far more dollars than it had gold to back them. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, even sent warships to New York Harbor to retrieve its gold reserves, openly challenging the credibility of the U.S. monetary system. Nixon knew the game was up. The gold drain was accelerating and the illusion of convertibility could not hold. To maintain the dollar's global supremacy, the U.S. had to abandon its own rules. But it wasn't just about money, it was about power. Keeping the dollar alive without gold meant America could now finance deficits without restraint, fund wars without accountability, and export inflation across the globe without a single shot fired. The announcement on August 15 wasn't made out of strength. It was a defensive move by an empire trying to protect its monetary throne. Nixon framed it as an economic emergency, blaming international speculators and promising it would help stabilize the economy. But what he really did was unleash an age of fiat dominance where money could be created at will, detached from any intrinsic value. Overnight, every major currency became paper backed by nothing but promises. Trust became the new gold, and central banks became gods. For the average citizen, this shift was invisible. No one rang alarm bells. No protests. Just quiet compliance. But the consequences would echo for decades. From stagflation in the 70s to asset bubbles in the 2000s, from the 2008 meltdown to the post-2020 printing frenzy. Every economic tremor today traces its roots back to that Sunday night in 1971. To understand the gravity of what happened in 1971, we have to rewind to the end of World War II. The world was shattered. Europe lay in ruins. Economies were broken. And out of that rubble emerged a new order, Bretton Woods. In 1944, delegates from 44 allied nations gathered in New Hampshire to rebuild the global financial system. The agreement they forged was revolutionary. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and all other currencies would peg themselves to the dollar. America, with the largest gold reserves on Earth and a booming industrial base untouched by war, became the center of the global monetary universe. The dollar wasn't just a currency, it was a promise. Every dollar was theoretically exchangeable for a fixed amount of gold. That promise created trust, and trust gave America power. Real, unchecked, global power. But over time, the temptation to cheat grew too strong. The U.S. government began to abuse its privileged role. Under Bretton Woods, the U.S. could print dollars and the world would accept them, as long as they believed those dollars were backed by gold. But behind closed doors, the math was falling apart. Vietnam, the space race, the Great Society welfare programs, all funded through massive deficit spending. By the late 1960s, there were far more dollars in circulation globally than the U.S. had gold to redeem. Foreign governments noticed. France became the loudest critic. De Gaulle called out the U.S. for exploiting what he termed an exorbitant privilege, being able to print a reserve currency without discipline. French officials flew to the U.S. demanding their gold. Others followed. The U.S. gold supply began to hemorrhage. Panic started to spread among central banks. If America couldn't honor its gold promise, the entire system would collapse. Enter Nixon. In 1971, with the gold drain reaching crisis levels, Nixon convened his top advisors at Camp David. The decision they made was bold, unprecedented, and cloaked in secrecy. On August 15, Nixon went live on national television and declared a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. He blamed foreign governments and speculators for attacking the dollar. He never admitted the U.S. had been overprinting, and he never said the suspension would be permanent. But it was. That broadcast was the quiet funeral of the Bretton Woods system. No gunfire, no parades, just a few calm sentences on TV that detonated the foundation of modern money. What Nixon did wasn't just end gold convertibility. It ended the era of monetary restraint. From that moment on, fiat currency, money created by government decree, reigned supreme. Dollars were no longer tied to anything tangible. They were now backed solely by confidence, by belief, by the illusion of value. It was a profound psychological shift. The world didn't collapse immediately. In fact, markets cheered. Freed from the gold constraint, governments could spend more, borrow more, stimulate more. But underneath, something irreversible had changed. Money had become political. The effects began slowly but built over time. The 1970s saw wild inflation, oil shocks, and economic stagnation. The dollar's purchasing power eroded rapidly. The price of gold, once fixed at $35 an ounce, shot to over $800 by the end of the decade. Confidence wavered. The middle class was squeezed. Savings were decimated. The illusion of price stability was shattered. But instead of returning to sound money, policymakers doubled down. They embraced fiat. They normalized it. And they built an entire financial architecture on its shaky foundation. Then came the 1980s and 1990s, decades of deregulation and debt-fueled expansion. Credit cards exploded. Mortgages grew. Wall Street boomed. All built on one simple idea. Money is infinite as long as people believe in it. By the 2000s, this belief reached its peak. Governments and central banks stopped fearing deficits. The housing bubble inflated. Derivatives multiplied. Financial institutions became addicted to leverage. Then came 2008, the ultimate test of fiat's durability. When the system cracked, the response wasn't reform. It was stimulus. Trillions were printed. Interest rates were slashed to zero. Banks were bailed out. The lesson was clear. In a fiat world, problems are solved with more fiat. And then came 2020. The pandemic was the perfect cover for monetary extremism. Central banks unleashed a tidal wave of new money. M2 money supply in the U.S. exploded. Governments issued record-breaking debt to fund stimulus checks, lockdowns, bailouts. It was modern monetary theory in action. Print now, deal with consequences later. For a while, it seemed to work. Markets soared. Unemployment dropped. But then inflation returned. Real, painful, generational inflation. Grocery bills rose. Rents spiked. Energy costs climbed. The purchasing power of fiat, already damaged, began to collapse in plain sight. And yet, there is no going back. Gold is no longer part of the conversation in mainstream policy circles. Sound money is ridiculed. Those who question fiat are labeled extremists. But deep down, people know something is wrong. Trust is eroding. Faith in central banks is cracking. Younger generations, who've only known debt, crisis, and inflation, are searching for alternatives. Bitcoin, gold, gold, anything that isn't printable. Because whether they realize it or not, they are living in the long shadow of 1971. What Nixon did was bigger than politics. It was a turning point in civilization. He ended an era of restraint and accountability. He gave the modern world the power to create unlimited money, and with it, unlimited distortion. Since that day, every major economic crisis has had the same root. Too much easy money chasing too few real assets. It began with a Sunday night announcement. And now, 50 years later, we are still feeling the aftershocks. The system didn't collapse in one day. It is collapsing in slow motion, and the cracks are only getting wider. The aftermath of Nixon's decision was not immediate chaos, but a slow unraveling hidden beneath the surface of economic growth and political stability. In the years that followed, leaders and economists across the West reassured the public that floating exchange rates and fiat money were modern, flexible, even superior. They claimed the world had matured beyond the rigidities of gold. But the truth was far darker. Without the discipline of convertibility, governments gained the power to borrow and spend without restraint, and central banks became architects of artificial prosperity. Interest rates were manipulated, money supply became a tool of politics, and debt, once a signal of caution, became the fuel of the system. The guardrails were gone. Fiat money wasn't just a tool anymore. It became the oxygen of the entire economy. In the 1980s, under Reagan and Volcker, there was a brief attempt to restore some form of credibility. Volcker raised interest rates to break inflation, which had spiraled out of control throughout the 70s. It worked, but at a terrible cost. Unemployment spiked. Businesses failed. The U.S. economy was nearly brought to its knees to undo the inflation unleashed by the death of gold convertibility. Yet even this painful correction didn't result in a return to monetary discipline. It simply bought time. What followed in the 1990s and early 2000s was a financial era built on cheap credit, exploding asset prices, and a belief that central banks could manage everything. Greenspan became a godlike figure. Wall Street thrived, but underneath the boom, debt kept rising. Every new crisis, from the dot-com bust to 9/11 to the housing bubble, was met with the same response: lower rates, more liquidity, more leverage. It was a cycle of addiction. And like any addiction, it needed higher doses over time. The 2008 financial crisis shattered the illusion of control. The global banking system nearly collapsed, exposing how fragile the fiat world had become. Derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, shadow banks, these were all enabled by an environment where money had no anchor. But instead of restructuring, governments and central banks doubled down again. Quantitative easing, zero interest rates, bank bailouts, the solutions only deepened the dependency on printed money. What should have been a reckoning became another round of denial. Debt soared. Inequality widened. Real wages stagnated. But asset prices boomed, enriching the elite and crushing the middle class. It was a transfer of wealth powered by monetary manipulation. Then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic was the catalyst for the largest monetary expansion in human history. Within months, central banks around the world printed trillions. Fiscal authorities borrowed as if the future didn't exist. Modern monetary theory, once fringe, became default policy. The line between central banks and governments dissolved. Money was no longer neutral, it was weaponized. Stimulus checks were issued. Markets surged while small businesses died. Inflation, dormant for years, returned with vengeance. First it was called transitory. Then it was redefined. But by 2022 it was undeniable. The purchasing power of fiat was collapsing in real time. Grocery bills, rents, energy, everything soared. Wages couldn't keep up. Savings were eroded. And trust in the monetary system began to fracture visibly. People started asking hard questions. Why can central banks create money out of nothing? Why does inflation always hit the poor first and worst? Why do assets rise while essentials become unaffordable? And more importantly, what gives this money value, if not gold, if not labor, if not production? The only answer left was trust. And trust was wearing thin. Younger generations who had never seen a world with stable money turned to alternatives. Cryptocurrencies boomed, not because of their technology, but because of their symbolism. Bitcoin, gold, even collectibles became lifeboats in a sea of devaluation. This wasn't just a financial movement, it was psychological. A quiet rebellion against a system built on printed promises. And yet, the system limps on. Governments can't return to gold. Central banks can't stop printing. The debt is too large, the politics too fragile. Any real return to sound money would trigger a deflationary collapse of unimaginable scale. So they stall. They obfuscate. They rename. But the damage is cumulative. The more money is created, the more distorted the real economy becomes. Productivity decouples from earnings. Work loses meaning. Speculation replaces savings. And slowly, the very idea of money, what it is, what it represents, begins to rot from within. That rot traces back to August 15, 1971. It began with a quiet speech and a broken promise. And it ended with generations questioning whether the system itself is legitimate. Not just in America, but across the globe. Because once the foundation of money becomes trust alone, every shock becomes existential. Every recession, every inflation wave, every political crisis threatens to unravel the illusion. And once enough people stop believing the system doesn't bend, it breaks. Today, we live in a world entirely shaped by that one decision in 1971. Every major economic trend, from soaring asset prices to generational inequality, can be traced back to the removal of gold as the foundation of money. What was once a system grounded in scarcity and accountability has become a system of infinite expansion, backed by nothing but political will and mass compliance. This transformation didn't just affect governments and institutions. It rewired the way individuals think about value, savings, and work. The idea of saving money, for example, has become almost irrational in a system where inflation eats away at purchasing power faster than most can earn. People are now pushed into risky investments not by greed, but by necessity. Holding cash feels like holding ice. Real estate, stocks, and commodities have become the new stores of value, not because they produce more, but because fiat produces less. Home prices have skyrocketed not due to rising incomes or innovation, but because cheap money needs a place to go. And when capital is this abundant, it stops seeking productivity and instead chases speculation. Entire generations are priced out of owning homes. Young people drown in debt just to get an education or afford rent. Meanwhile, those closest to the monetary spigot, banks, hedge funds, governments, accumulate wealth at record speed. It's not a free market. It's a distortion field powered by artificial money. The psychological toll is immense. People feel the system is rigged, but can't articulate why. They work harder and earn less in real terms. They see markets go up while their grocery bills double. They hear about GDP growth and record profits while struggling to cover rent. The disconnect isn't accidental, it's structural. Fiat money allows governments to paper over problems, delay hard choices, and inject liquidity at will. But it comes at a cost: moral hazard, social division, and eroding trust. The value of money is no longer grounded in labor or production. It's grounded in proximity to the printer. For the middle class, this has been devastating. Wages have barely kept up with inflation for decades. Meanwhile, the cost of essentials, housing, healthcare, education, has surged far beyond official CPI figures. Savers are punished. Debtors are rewarded. And those who play the game of leverage and speculation are elevated to God status. This is not capitalism in its pure form. It's a distorted version where risk is subsidized, failure is bailed out, and the consequences of reckless policy are socialized onto the public. And yet, few dare question the root cause. Talk of returning to gold is dismissed as fantasy. Criticism of central banks is framed as extremism. But the truth is, the current system only works as long as the illusion holds. As long as people believe this paper has value. As long as faith exceeds fear. But that faith is crumbling. Slowly. Quietly. And in its place, questions are growing. What is money if not backed by something real? How long can a system like this endure? What happens when belief runs out? We are now entering a phase where the consequences of 5 decades of fiat are becoming impossible to ignore. Inflation isn't just a number, it's a lived experience. Trust isn't just a concept, it's a currency. And once it's spent, there's no printing it back. Speculation is growing that we are reaching the final stretch of this grand fiat experiment. The signs are everywhere. Inflation has become sticky, not fleeting. Central banks, once seen as guardians of stability, are now trapped. Raise rates and risk collapse, lower them and risk hyperinflation. The balancing act has become impossible. Meanwhile, nations around the world are quietly preparing for alternatives. BRICS countries are exploring trade settlements outside the US dollar. China and Russia are accumulating gold. Digital currencies are being tested by dozens of central banks, promising more control, but also signaling a transition to a new kind of monetary regime, one even more centralized, more programmable, and potentially more dangerous. It's not just about economics anymore. It's about sovereignty, trust, and survival. If the current system collapses, it won't happen overnight. It will erode, gradually, then suddenly. Confidence will fray at the edges. A failed bond auction here, a banking crisis there, a sudden loss of faith in a major currency. We've already seen the dress rehearsals: Greece, Turkey, Lebanon, Sri Lanka. But what happens when the contagion spreads to core nations? What happens when the illusion fails at the center, not the periphery? One possible future is fragmentation, a world of competing blocks, each with its own currency system and rule. Another is consolidation, global adoption of digital central bank currencies under tighter control. But either way, the era of effortless money is ending. The tide is pulling back, and it's revealing just how naked the foundations have become. And in this moment of uncertainty, gold reemerges, not as a barbarous relic, but as a timeless benchmark. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. In a world drowning in promises, tangibility becomes revolutionary. The question now is not if the fiat system will end, but how, and what will rise to replace it. August 15, 1971, was more than just a policy change. It was the quiet funeral of sound money. That night, without a vote, without a war, without public consent, the world was thrown into an era of unlimited fiat currency, where debt became virtue and restraint became obsolete. Nixon didn't just suspend convertibility. He opened the door to a new monetary religion, one based not on value, but on belief. And for decades, that belief held. But now, the cracks are visible. Inflation is no longer theory, it's reality. Trust is no longer assumed, it must be earned. And money is no longer neutral. It's political, fragile, and increasingly resented. We were told the gold standard was outdated. But what replaced it has led to spiraling debt, speculative bubbles, and widening inequality. This was never just about gold. It was about accountability. Once that was removed, everything else began to erode. Savings, wages, opportunity, trust. A generation raised on fiat has never known stable money. They were taught to invest, to speculate, to chase returns, because holding cash is financial suicide. That is not stability. That is silent desperation. And now, as the cycle reaches its limit, we stand on the edge of something new. The end of fiat won't be a headline. It will be a shift in behavior, a slow, irreversible exit from trust-based currency into something tangible. Maybe it's gold, maybe Bitcoin, maybe a return to regional trade systems. But the age of pretending this can last forever is over. The dollar didn't die in a crash. It died in a broadcast. And history may one day look back on that quiet Sunday evening as the moment everything changed. Not with panic, but with a smile, a camera, and a lie.